Buenas tardes. Gracias por invitarme a presentar a mi colega, compatriota, compañera, Yarimar Bonilla. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to have this opportunity. Taken to the mic, shouldn't I? Yeah, I should know these things by now, you think. I have this thing here, so I think this does it. Yeah, thank you. Again, my name is Ruben Gastamide Fernandez. I'm a professor in the Department of Curriculum at OIZ. And it's really a peculiar pleasure to introduce a Puerto Rican scholar speaking about Puerto Rico here, not just at York, but in Canada in general. I've been here in Canada for 13 years. And my first impressions were that Canadians, Puerto Rico figures as a bit of a shadow in the Canadian imaginary. We kind of don't exist. I remember, in fact, in one of my first introductions to the staff at my place of work, I introduced myself and said, yeah, I'm from the Caribbean. And the person said, oh, from the Caribbean. And they kind of looked at me dumbfounded and said, you're from the Caribbean? And I said, yeah, of course, I'm from Puerto Rico. That's not the Caribbean. That was their offhanded remark. And I was kind of flabbergasted, because as somebody from the Caribbean, who very much has a very strong identity as being from the Caribbean, to be sort of just offhandedly told you're not from the Caribbean was just very bizarre. And then, of course, the second time, as I said to someone, I'm from Puerto Rico, and they said to me, yeah, San Jose is beautiful. And then said, you guys have a wonderful, they said, good luck at the World Cup. The only times that this wouldn't happen, I learned very quickly, was when I was talking to Canadian baseball fans. Because they know that Roberto Alomar was the real star of the Blue Jays 1992 and 1993 baseball team that won the World Cup series. And they had this very clear in their imaginary. So for them, Puerto Rico was very, very clear. And they knew exactly where it was. And they also sometimes knew that Puerto Rico had a colonial relationship with the United States, and therefore was part of the reason why we sort of figure so prominently in Major League Baseball. So it's very unique opportunity and a really great pleasure to be in a Canadian space where we are invited to think about Puerto Rico. It's unfortunate that the reason why that has come about is because of the effects of the Hurricane Maria, the economic disaster that the event that was Maria provoked, or rather brought into light, because it wasn't provoked by Maria, it was already there and highlighted by the experience, as I'm sure that our guest tonight will highlight. And then most recently, the other reason why I have been in conversations about Puerto Rico with Canadians is because my son, who is an avid musical theater protege, or whatever you call it, up and coming or something, has been cast, guessing what show? West Side Story. Puerto Ricans' favorite show to hate. Even Lin-Manuel Miranda commented on the ambivalent relationship that Puerto Ricans have with West Side Story. We love it and we hate it all at the same time. And so I asked the director and the producer, I said, if you're going to have my son acting in West Side Story, you're going to have to put up with me. And you're going to have to put up with me coming to tell you about Puerto Rico and how it came to be that Puerto Ricans figure in this remake of Romeo and Juliet that was initially intended to be about Catholics and Jews. I don't know if you know this part of the story of West Side Story. But then Leonard Bernstein realized that it wasn't credible, at least for a Protestant white audience in New York. It just wasn't credible to have Catholics and Jews killing each other in the streets of New York. It was far more credible to have Puerto Ricans killing people in the streets of New York, and therefore cast Puerto Ricans. And so I'm caught in this weird space of these opportunities to talk about Puerto Rico. So you can imagine my pleasure at having a smart conversation with a smart Puerto Rican about what's happening in Puerto Rico today. And so Yarimar Bonilla, our guest tonight, is an associate professor in the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies and Anthropology at Rutgers University. She's a political anthropologist specializing in questions of sovereignty, citizenship, and race across the Americas. She has tracked these issues across a broad range of sites and practices, including post-colonial politics in the French Caribbean, the role of digital protest in the Black Lives Matter movement, the politics of the Trump presidency, the Puerto Rican statehood movement. There is a Puerto Rican statehood movement. And interestingly, well, I'll comment on this another time, but how decolonization figures in the pro-statehood movement is actually really bizarre, but Yarimar has a lot to say about that. And her current research, for which she was named the 2018 Carnegie Fellow on the political, economic, and social aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Dr. Bonilla is the author of Non-Sovereign Futures, French Caribbean Politics in the Wake of Disenchantment, published by University of Chicago Press, which examines the political possibilities that emerge in the wake of disenchantment with post-colonial sovereignty through an ethnographic study of labor activism in the French Caribbean island of Guadeloupe. And she's editor of the forthcoming Aftershocks of Disaster, Puerto Rico Before and After the Storm. In addition, she's currently section editor of public anthropologies for the journal American Anthropologist and co-director of the Puerto Rican Syllabus Project. And for those of you who are interested in Puerto Rico, I really strongly encourage you to look up the Puerto Rico Syllabus Project, because the number of resources, really, really, really good resources, even just at a very basic level of why precisely is Puerto Rico a colony, what is that history about, and it's really, really, really wonderful. So I really encourage you. And I'm very grateful to Yarimar for organizing that and for being one of the co-organizers of that, because it has been really helpful to just refer people to, when they ask me silly questions about Puerto Rico, to just say, just look for the syllabus. So I'm very grateful for that. And lastly, she's also the frequent contributor to media outlets such as the Washington Post and The Nation, as well as a frequent guest in national public radio and television news programs such as Democracy Now! And tonight, in her talk, The Coloniality of Disaster, Race, Empire, and Emergency in Puerto Rico, USA, she will examine how catastrophic events like hurricanes, earthquakes, as well as forms of political and economic crisis deepen the fault lines of long-existing racial and colonial histories. Drawing on ethnographic research conducted before and after Hurricane Maria, she will explore how attention to the coloniality of disaster requires a move away from an emphasis on resilience, turning instead towards new visions of repair and redress. So join me on welcoming Dr. Yarimar Bonilla.
Thank you, Ruben, for that kind introduction. I was actually the research assistant for Ruben's father at the University of Puerto Rico when I was an undergrad. So this is a funny coincidence. Before beginning, I would like to first acknowledge that this university sits on stolen land. And coming from a U.S. colony, I stand in solidarity with the First Nations for not just recognition, but also forms of decolonization and redress that access that fact. Let me see if this, okay. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the term disaster as both an event or fact that has unfortunate consequences, as well as a person or thing that is a complete failure. Perhaps this double meaning explains why some residents in Puerto Rico responded to Hurricane Maria by producing graffiti that stated, "El desastre es la colonia," the disaster is the colony. The slogan suggests that the true catastrophe in contemporary Puerto Rico was not produced by the sudden arrival of a Category 5 storm, but by the slowly accruing effects of colonialism and the failed promises of decolonization. Since Hurricane Maria, I have been trying to think and write about how this storm ripped the veil off of Puerto Rico's colonial status, both for those observing from afar who had perhaps never stopped to contemplate what Puerto Rico's relationship to the United States entailed, as well as for local residents who were forced into an affective reckoning with the kinds of structural violence that they had been enduring for decades. Given all this, my focus has thus not been on what Hurricane Maria caused, something which I think will take many years to become fully apparent, but rather on what it revealed, namely how it laid bare the forms of structural violence and racial colonial governance that had been operating in Puerto Rico for over a century. In this project, I'm thus interested in thinking about the kinds of political life that can take shape in the wake of a disaster. And again, by disaster, I mean not just an event of unfortunate consequences, but also a failure. Specifically, the failure of the post-colonial state. I ask, what political forms might emerge from this space of catastrophic sedimentation? And what kinds of political subjectivities might develop when the future appears even more disastrous? The fact is that in contemporary Puerto Rico, much of what looks like the product of a devastating hurricane is actually the result of a failed neo-colonial experiment. Long before Maria, the Puerto Rican landscape was already dominated by signs of ruin: bankruptcy, default, foreclosure, displacement, dispossession, exile, decay, and neglect. This is why at present you will find more slogans denouncing colonialism than denouncing FEMA, and why you will also find signs placed on crumbling infrastructure, like the one here, clarifying that Maria was not the culprit. In this paper, I wish to examine how contemporary Puerto Ricans are navigating not only the material ruins of a hurricane-ravaged society, but also the imperial debris of a failed colonial and post-colonial experiment. Since its acquisition by the United States, Puerto Rico has served as a site of experimentation, broadly speaking. Everything from birth control and sterilization procedures to deadly pesticides and military weaponry were tested and refined on Puerto Rican soil. Experiments have been conducted on its land and its people, but also on its economy and forms of governance. From the moment of its non-incorporation into the Federation of the U.S. as a territory that, quote, belongs to but is not a part of the United States, Puerto Rico has served as a site from which to test the limits of stratified inclusion, structural violence, and racial governance. In the second half of the 20th century, Puerto Rico also became a testing ground for experiments in decolonization. Puerto Rico's Commonwealth status, locally referred to as the ELA, an acronym for Estado Libre Asociado, was developed as a way of meeting the rising calls for self-determination around the globe. At the moment of its founding, the ELA was described as a bilateral pact that would grant Puerto Rico a certain measure of self-governance while remaining in association with the United States. This was not an entirely unique relationship, but rather part of the development of a larger non-sovereign Caribbean. Around the same time of the establishment of the ELA, both the Dutch and the French Antilles were engaging in similar forms of non-sovereign incorporation to their metropolies, while in the British Caribbean, the West Indies Federation and later the Commonwealth of Nations were taking shape. In the second half of the 20th century, residents of both newly independent nations and of the Commonwealth's departments and other post-colonial experiments in the Caribbean were promised a bright post-colonial future driven by economic growth and development. Indeed, Puerto Rico's Commonwealth status was touted as a temporary measure that would lift the island into the prosperity necessary for either statehood or independence. However, as with decolonizing projects throughout the region, those promises soon began to fade. In the first decades following the establishment of the ELA, Puerto Rico experienced rapid industrialization and economic progress, benefiting greatly from the post-war New Deal policies. The results were celebrated as exemplars of U.S.-led capitalist development, and Puerto Rico was showcased as an alternative to the development of left-wing politics in other parts of the region. Showcased literally in Time magazine and other venues. However, as early as the 1970s, as the global economy experienced significant shocks due to drop in oil prices, it was already becoming clear that the policies implemented were not leading to true self-sustained growth. By the 1990s, when the Clinton administration removed tax incentives that had once lured manufacturing industries to the island, Puerto Rico's economy began its historic downturn. As a result, local administrators turned to heavy borrowing, with heavy assistance from Wall Street to compensate and mask a deflated economic base. By 2015, Puerto Rico's governor declared that the island was at risk of descending into what economists describe as a financial death spiral. For many, this was just a confirmation of the looming sense of doom that had already presided over the society for decades. Following the governor's declaration that Puerto Rico's debt was unpayable, the federal government denied the island the right to declare bankruptcy. Instead, a fiscal control board was installed in what for many represented a return to a previous era of overt colonial rule. The contemporary debt crisis thus made clear what many had long known, that the Commonwealth status created in 1952 had been a mere facade for an enduring colonial condition. Many heralded this moment as, quote, la muerte del ELA, or the death of the Commonwealth. This was accompanied by staged funeral processions, the display of Puerto Rican flags recast in black and white, and performative mortuary rites. This political death was in turn followed by the imposition of severe economic measures by both the fiscal board and the local government, in what has increasingly come to be understood as a political experiment in new forms of austerity governance. Puerto Rico had then thus shifted from being a laboratory of modernist development to an experimental site of neoliberal management. Indeed, several of the fiscal board members have expressed this and made clear that they are seeking new and creative ways to manage U.S. territories. The austerity regime that followed produced an even greater landscape of ruin: shuttered elementary schools, a gutted public university, a defunded health system, crumbling infrastructure, and a migratory crisis that generated the increasing feeling of an emptying island. For those who stayed, new forms of living in and through crisis began to develop. A slick marketing campaign was developed imploring folks to keep their chins up and to not quit, to no quitarse. It sought to promote toughing it out, not quitting, and instead enduring, facing head-on the mechanisms of slow violence that austerity implies. Many interpreted this slogan as a jab on those who migrated, but the fact is that those who have left have also had to endure as they confront the naked racism of the United States under the Trump regime. Many of those I've interviewed in the diaspora have spoken about the challenges they face as they are suddenly berated aggressively for speaking Spanish in public, while also having to manage the new effective terrain of exile. And then Maria hit. Amidst what was already a landscape of ruin, this Category 5 storm led to the deadliest disaster in modern U.S. history, producing more casualties than 9/11. These deaths, however, were not caused by the winds and rains of Maria, but by the crisis of infrastructure that followed, which was itself a product of Puerto Rico's century-long colonial experiment. Indeed, it has been little noted that Maria arrived precisely around the 100th anniversary of U.S. citizenship on the island. As a result, for over a decade now, Puerto Ricans have been assuming that things are only going to get worse. Since the declaration of the financial death spiral, Puerto Ricans have had to contend with a future that heralds greater austerity and social decay. The university is under threat of losing its accreditation due to drastic budget cuts. The governor threatened to reduce funding for the hospital system. The Department of Education has been shutting down schools and pushing towards a charter system modeled on post-Katrina New Orleans. And now hurricane recovery plans are feared to lead to even greater displacement as communities face the threat of being forcibly relocated from newly declared zones of environmental vulnerability. Meanwhile, and this is some mapping that is being produced by local organizations looking at the zones that are now being declared and vulnerable to disaster. At the same time, 98% of the territory, the map that appears all in red, has been declared an opportunity zone for foreign investment. As a result, privatization, profiteering, and dispossession loom threateningly on the horizon. Political life in Puerto Rico must thus contend with both a contemporary landscape marked by the ruins of a previous colonial experiment and a future horizon that only heralds further social decay. Part of what I am interested in thinking about is how this requires a new political orientation that breaks with modernist assumptions of a better future. The Italian philosopher Franco Berardi refers to this process as the slow cancellation of the future, which he describes as the increasing lack of faith in the modernist mythology of linear development and increasing prosperity. Mark Fisher describes this as a feeling of belatedness, of having arrived, quote, after the gold rush. However, in the case of the Caribbean, this feeling is not that of a future superseded, but more precisely of a future foreclosed. As one current political slogan in Puerto Rico suggests, se acabaron las promesas. The promises are over. In other words, what Puerto Ricans face at present is not the end of a political project, but rather the end of its promise. That is, Puerto Ricans must now contend with the idea of losing something they never really obtained. Again, I'm interested in how this current moment requires a political stance that is centered not in what Laurent Berlant describes as cruel optimism, that lulls one into a continued faith in liberal democratic promises of what is to come, but rather on a particular form of pessimism, a belief that things are awful and not necessarily going to be repaired. Indeed, many believe that in Puerto Rico there will be no recovery, if by recovery we mean a return to a faith in the promises of the ELA. Of course, the question then becomes, to echo Benjamin, how exactly does one organize pessimism? How can we live and act politically in the absence of a faith in a better future? How can we develop not a cruel optimism that blinds us to what is to come, but rather a hopeful pessimism that can serve to build politically in the face of ruin and the promise of further decay? This question seems imperative in an era of climate change, when we know with certainty that natural disasters are on the rise, as well as in an era of post-colonial crisis, when the promises of decolonization have been extinguished. The Puerto Rican historian and activist Rafael Bernabe has argued that hope can actually be nurtured by pessimism. Following Terry Eagleton, Bernabe calls for hope without optimism, that is, a faith in political action, even in the midst of great uncertainty regarding where that action might ultimately lead. I believe this kind of hopeful pessimism might be what is necessary to move beyond what David Scott has described as our, quote, arrested post-colonial present, or what I've previously described as the wake of disenchantment, an era in which the political models of the past have lost their purchase, but new political forms, vocabularies, and imaginaries are yet to emerge. In other words, perhaps pessimism is what we need to move beyond a nostalgic immobility. In order to think about this further, I would like to examine the forms of political life that emerged in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. The rest of my talk will consist of two parts. First, I would like to take a step back and discuss the experience of the storm itself and how it was conditioned by the pre-existing economic disaster that had taken shape before Maria. Then I will turn to how local residents are trying to reimagine the island's political future in the aftermath of this catastrophic sedimentation. I will end by taking up the question of recovery and how it relates to the larger challenge of imagining new political futures in the wake of disaster. Now, one thread that will run through this presentation is an attempt to think about what we might call the temporality of disaster, specifically how catastrophic events, including colonialism and climate change, impact our experience of time, progression, futurity, and possibility. My entry point for thinking about these questions is the politics of time, partly because one of the striking things about the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico was the way in which it operated as a moment of temporal rupture. It was as if the storm managed to stop time. For weeks on end, there was no school, no work, no power, no lights, no phones, no internet, no television, no public services. With hospitals closed or able to attend to only the most critically ill, sick patients were sent home, unable to receive things such as cancer treatment or dialysis. Without electricity, funeral homes were unable to embalm the dead. Although given the impassable roads, many are said to have buried the dead in their own backyards. For weeks on end, roads remained blocked, food, water, and gasoline were scarce, and phones were inoperable. I've thought about temporal ruptures like this before, particularly in my writings about labor strikes in the French Caribbean. There, I looked at how social movements like general strikes, hunger strikes, or political encampments create breaks in quotidian routines, providing liminal moments of temporal suspension in which new futures can become imaginable. However, the temporality of a social movement is quite different from that of a disaster. In the context of social movements, the present seems to expand in the sense that it becomes overly eventful. Social movements are known to produce a kind of sped up time. As Lenin famously said, there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. The temporal mode of emergency also comes with a heightened state of awareness, a surge of adrenaline, a perceived need to move fast, to act quick, to fix, to save, to repair, to restore. This in turn creates the expectation of change, a desire and perceived need to move out of the present state. That is, there is an assumption that the temporal mode of emergency will be fleeting, quickly shifting over into that of recovery. Emergency is not expected to be an enduring state. However, in the context of post-Hurricane Puerto Rico, this feeling of urgency was met with a crushing wall of inaction. The present did not expand in its eventfulness, but in its persistence. For weeks after Maria, there was no progression, just standstill. Each day felt like the previous one. Indeed, as one woman I interviewed in the town of Comerío, who had spent the previous 4 months fighting with FEMA to get a tarp on her roofless home, suggested, if anything, each day felt worse. What characterized life after Maria was thus not progress, but delay, deterioration, degradation, and the forced act of waiting. First, residents waited for Maria itself to arrive. They stockpiled subsistence, gathered those they called family, took stock of what they held dear, and prepared themselves for the worst. Then, for nearly 24 hours, rain beat down steadily on fragile homes. Water poured in through windows and leaky roofs. Gusts of wind ripped windows straight off their hinges, and rivers spilled out from their banks, pushing residents onto their rooftops in search of dry land. Many of those I've interviewed spent the entire storm holding on to a door that Maria seemed intent on ripping away. Some had to leave their flooding homes mid-storm and wade through chest-deep waters to find safety. Others have children who still wake up in the middle of the night afraid that they or their parents might be drowning. Those of us in the diaspora went through our own process of suspension. We held our breath from across the ocean. We heard the howling winds through phone lines and social media posts. We felt the lights go out and the cell towers drop. And we panicked when suddenly our loved ones fell out of digital reach. And so everyone waited for the storm to pass, thinking foolishly that the winds and rain would be the worst of it, not realizing that the true disaster was not the storm itself, but what was laid bare by its passing. The neglected infrastructure of an island in crisis, the economic cleavages of a society marked by profound disparity, the naked disdain of an imperial state, and the forms of structural neglect and social abandonment that had already come to characterize this bankrupt colony. After the wind subsided, residents once again waited for roads to be cleared, for the lights to come back on, for stores to reopen, for cell service to return, and for running water to be restored. They endured long lines, anywhere from 6 to 8 hours, to obtain basic necessities such as food, fuel, and ice. For those who lost their homes, there was no line, just the labyrinth of bureaucracy. They were told to sign up for FEMA assistance on the web, which was impossible since they had no electricity, internet, or cell service. Once they figured out how to fill out their paperwork, they were then told to wait in their destroyed homes without cleaning or repairing the damage, dwelling in disaster until the fabled FEMA inspectors could come to calculate their loss. Those too sick, too old, too young, or too impatient to weather this period, or those for whom Puerto Rico will no longer be home, headed to the airport in record numbers, often abandoning their cars in the parking lot with the keys inside for the bank to repossess. Many residents expressed frustration with this feeling of stalled time. The halt of capitalist flows, the halt of modernity, suddenly made it clear that Puerto Rico was one of those islands. Puerto Ricans had long imagined that long lines, shortages, rationing, and a dependency on the diaspora were things experienced elsewhere. It was believed that U.S.-led development had raised Puerto Rico above the standard of living of its Caribbean neighbors. Many thought that being a U.S. citizen meant not having to stand in line for food or going to a river for water. But that was not the case. The cavalry did not arrive. Government trucks did not turn up to clear the debris. Instead, neighbors had to clear their own paths with machetes. Tankers of drinking water didn't appear, so residents headed to the rivers with buckets, or built their own makeshift infrastructure out of PVC pipes connected directly to mountain springs. They drank rainwater or opened up wells that were later revealed to be toxic. Food was not delivered for weeks, so community kitchens sprung up, sometimes feeding a single block, sometimes feeding half the town. For weeks on end, there were no aid workers, no helicopters, no military hospitals, no distribution centers. The state simply left its citizens waiting. When government aid finally arrived, it came as a slow and insufficient trickle, with none of the shock and awe that many had come to associate with the most powerful military in the world. A can of sausages, a bag of Skittles, a roll of paper towels. This is not the imagined bounty of empire. Many of those who were able to survive the storm were lost to its wake. They succumbed to what anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Triot once described as ordinary accidents and ordinary diseases, so ordinary that anywhere else they would have been treated or avoided altogether. They contracted banal diseases like conjunctivitis due to lack of sanitation, and more deadly ones produced by animal corpses in the rivers and rat droppings in the debris. Some were run over in the night by cars due to the lack of streetlights. Others were killed in accidents at intersections without traffic signals. Others, like the man pictured here, choked in the night due to sleep apnea because electricity could no longer power his CPAP machine. At one point, people thought that what was needed in Puerto Rico was more media coverage. But the media came, they documented, they managed to keep the story alive. Puerto Rico was featured in news reports to an unprecedented degree. But this didn't make a difference. The suffering continued. It wasn't a secret, it was a public display. Even the reporters from U.S. news outlets felt as if they were trapped in a state of suspension and repetition. CBS reporter David Begnaud said to his anchor, "I've never covered a natural disaster where the emergency was endless." More than a year after the storm, the social landscape remained stubbornly unchanged. Electric cables still dangle perilously in the air, just mere inches from the cars passing beneath them. An estimated 60% of traffic lights are still not working. There is still little public lighting, and an enduring feeling of abandonment and ruin prevails. At a crossroads in Guaynabo, a road sign popped up, showing a broken streetlight. It's telling that I witnessed heated debate and speculation at a dinner table over whether this was an artistic statement or an actual government-produced sign. In other words, some were willing to entertain the idea that the government might never repair the traffic system and instead simply create a new iconography of disaster. Well-meaning progressive observers speculate, would this happen in a U.S. state? The answer is yes. The answer is Flint, where austerity measures led to a poisoned water supply that has yet to be remedied. Indeed, to understand Puerto Rico, we must place it within this larger archipelago of racialized neglect, connected through deep currents of racialized governance. Just as police brutality runs on a loop in the U.S. through cell phone videos of police assault and murder, so too do images of neglected populations, abandoned urban spaces in Detroit, poisoned water reserves in Flint, displaced communities in New Orleans, and Puerto Ricans left to wait on rooftops for aid that refuses to arrive. These are not mistakes or even events. Rather, these are the logics of disposability at work. As Christina Sharp asserts, this is the weather, the total climate, an environment in which Black and brown bodies are rendered disposable. Those who were quick to assert indignantly, "But these are U.S. citizens," seem to forget that citizenship does not save you. Citizenship does not mean you can't be shot dead in plain daylight by a police officer or left abandoned without food or water for days on end, on a rooftop, at a superdome, in a prison cell, or in a flood zone, abandoned and left simply to wait. It is precisely the second-class citizenship that Puerto Ricans have long experienced, the legal categories in which they have been purposefully placed through the technologies of racial colonial governance, which ensures that for years on end, Puerto Ricans will continue to wait under blue tarps, much like residents of New Orleans waited in FEMA trailers, pushed to the limits of bureaucratic exhaustion. Sociologist Javier Aullero suggests that waiting is a temporal process through which political subordination is produced. He argues that recipients of government assistance are often made to wait, days, months, even years, for the bureaucratic machineries of state assistance. Aullero shows how temporal delay operates as a governmental technique and an assertion of state power. However, as some anthropologists have suggested, waiting also implies the existence of a certain horizon of expectation, a faith in the chances of an arrival. Waiting, esperar, implies hope, esperanza. It involves anticipation, a form of thinking and living towards the future. So what happens when you stop waiting? What happens when you give up? In Puerto Rico at present, many have given up by taking their own lives or by getting on a plane. But you also have those who have given up on the government by individually taking on the task of recovery. I would like to turn now to think about how these political actions might help us think about post-disaster futures. There we go. Now, in the weeks after Hurricane Maria, there was a great deal of outrage over a statement made by Donald Trump on Twitter about Puerto Rico. In response to the mayor of San Juan's critiques of the recovery, he said that Puerto Ricans wanted everything done for them. He came under fire with good reason. However, as is often the case with Trump, his words spoke to a broader shared expectation, not just about the distribution of state resources, but also about disaster recovery and its agents. As I said, in the wake of the storm, many gave up on the government and instead of waiting, took it upon themselves to individually take on the task of recovery, clearing roads, setting up kitchens, delivering aid to forgotten residents, building roofs, and even directing traffic at intersections. One of the popular hashtags that emerged in the wake of the storm to push forward these efforts was Puerto Rico se levanta, or Puerto Rico gets itself back up. And this is an example of its usage on social media. The slogan was first used by the Puerto Rican government to inform the public about the process of recovery after Hurricane Irma, the first of the two back-to-back storms that hit the island. In the wake of Irma, the administration of newly elected Governor Ricardo Rosselló put out numerous highly stylized graphics on social media detailing recovery efforts. Their communication strategy included the slogan Puerto Rico se levanta as an assertion of governmental efficiency and care in the wake of the storm. However, after the second storm, Maria, there was no government. The head of emergency management made a statement to the press asking citizens to stay calm and wait because there was no working government and there wouldn't be for several days. And shortly after making the statement, he went on vacation. Now, for days on end, there was no communication between the central offices in San Juan and the different towns throughout Puerto Rico. For months, there was little progression or accountability about how and when residents would receive aid. Residents and local mayors were left in a limbo, forced to sort things out on their own. During this period, the hashtag Puerto Rico se levanta shifted from an assertion of governmental care to a demonstration of individual resilience. The hashtag was used to show images of residents coming together with their neighbors and finding creative solutions to the lack of infrastructure, such as building washing machines out of bicycle parts or creating power generators out of lawnmowers. Some of these posts showed residents taking on government roles, such as setting up centros de acopio or aid centers, delivering food and water to the rural parts of the island, and taking charge at intersections without signal lights to direct traffic. In other words, the hashtag was used to show how residents were stepping into the roles of an absent state. They say it takes 21 days for new habits to cement. The great majority of Puerto Ricans spent well over 100 days without electricity, running water, traffic signals, without the invisible infrastructure of daily life. Feeling abandoned by the government became habitual. Being forced to self-rely became ingrained. Many have celebrated Puerto Ricans' resilience in the aftermath of the storm. Indeed, it's quite remarkable that there was so little violence, looting, or unrest. However, one must wonder, what will this resilience and self-reliance produce in a place that was already bracing itself for austerity? At what point does self-reliance become a form of neoliberal endurance? Many I've interviewed emphasized that it was up to individuals to prepare for the storm. They had to fill their gas tanks, stockpile food and water, withdraw money from the bank before the storm hit. Some even thought that it was irresponsible, given Puerto Rico's decaying infrastructure, to not already have a generator or solar panels on your home. What is absent in this narrative is the fact that for many, hurricane preparedness had become impossible. The debt crisis had left individuals in a deep state of vulnerability, both societal in terms of fragile infrastructure, but also personal in terms of financial precarity, at the precise moment that they were being called upon to act as agents of their own recovery. I was struck by the irony of all this as I stumbled upon this sign in front of one of Puerto Rico's banks, which declared, "Un nuevo Puerto Rico está en uno," suggesting that a new Puerto Rico lies within each individual. Now, as I stated, and I'll get back to that creepy slogan. As stated earlier, since the storm, numerous organizations have come together to set up community kitchens, do solidarity brigades where they help clean up debris, bring tarps for those who are still roofless, distribute solar lights, and take charge, if not of the recovery, at least of the emergency, in the absence of an absent state. These projects are not radically different from the kind of urban gardens and other initiatives seen in places like Detroit that have also been abandoned by the state. However, in the colonial context of Puerto Rico, they constitute the search for an alternative form of sovereignty. That is, going off the grid or engaging in self-reliance in the context of contemporary Puerto Rico becomes a broader kind of freedom project that sees self-sufficiency and community care as a possible way of breaking with U.S. dependence. These initiatives are small, they are not territory-wide, instead they are each tied to particular constituencies or municipalities, and they are not interested in carrying out what in a different era one would call a mass movement. For some observers, myself included at times, there is something frustrating about this because their efforts don't look like a modernist political project. That is, they do not represent what anthropologist James Scott would describe as an effort to see like a state or think like a state. These various efforts are often described through the concept of autogestión, which had already become a watchword in Puerto Rico before Maria, particularly in the context of the debt crisis. It had become common to hear people talk about the need to autogestionarse. Taken literally, autogestión can be translated as self-reliance or self-management. That's what Google Translate will tell you if you look it up. However, gestionar can have a different meaning, not just of management, but of gestation, like a fetus. That is, it can be imagined as an act of incubating and developing a new being. At a recent event at the University of Puerto Rico, local scholar and filmmaker Mariolga Reyes Cruz talked about these projects specifically as ones of gestating sovereignty. In a speech titled Por quienes esperamos, the ones we are waiting for, or who are we waiting for, she said that Maria had demonstrated that Puerto Ricans didn't need to wait for anyone. While both local and federal governments stalled, Puerto Ricans had taken care of themselves. She asserted that the initiatives of autogestión emerging after Maria were thus not simply about taking on the task of recovery, but about reimagining the future. In her talk, she went on to directly connect the weight of Maria to the weight of colonialism, the weight that Puerto Ricans have been engaged in for over a century to resolve their political status, and suggested that in both cases, what appeared to be a wait was actually a process of gestation. While waiting for decolonization, she argued, community organizations in Puerto Rico had forged new visions of sovereignty. Food sovereignty through Back to the Land movements, territorial sovereignty through land occupations and community trust, energy sovereignty through solar power initiatives, and even political sovereignty through a reimagining of the means and forms of collective action. She also spoke of what I might call diasporic sovereignty, forged by Puerto Rican communities abroad who mobilized in the wake of the storm to send aid in the face of government abandonment. Looking to the future, she said it was now time to knit together these forms of sovereignty. Es hora de entretejer soberanías. It is unclear what this process will entail and where it will lead, but for Cruz and many others, this archipelago of sovereignty, which reaches beyond the territory and into the diaspora, offers a ray of hope within an otherwise bleak landscape. After both local and federal governments abandoned their citizens and forced them to wait, and in a context where over a decade of austerity and over a century of U.S. empire had already whittled down the expectations of state capacity and care, these islands of sovereignty offered an alternative. Now, I would like to end by giving the final word to a woman who I will call Annie, that I interviewed as part of my current study, who echoed in her own way the same arguments that Mariolga Cruz was trying to make at the university. Now, Annie is quite a charismatic character. She's an extremely youthful and stylish 71-year-old retired school teacher with short salt and pepper hair who is always relentlessly energetic and upbeat. And we hadn't been able to reach Annie for months after Maria because both her landline and her cell phone had stopped working. She had spent the hurricane, it turns out, alone in her home in a working-class suburb on the outskirts of San Juan, and later rode out the months of blackout with her daughter in Florida. I caught up with her a year after Maria after she was settling back into her life in San Juan. With her characteristic upbeat style, she said that she had suffered little damage or emotional stress during the hurricane. She had done everything she needed to prepare. She had stockpiled food, water, batteries, she had her medicines, and she had cash. In other words, she was a responsible, self-sufficient citizen. Her home suffered little damages, and in the days following the storm, she says she was happily in the bubble of her working-class neighborhood. Her aunts, uncles, and cousins all lived nearby, so they were able to spend those early days together, taking care of each other. Every day, her younger cousins would venture out to get water, ice, hot meals, and other supplies, and they would come back with stories of the long lines and shortages. But she says that they were just that, stories. Something you hear, something that happened to someone else, not something you lived through. She kept referring to those events as things that happened afuera, outside of her little bubble. After a few weeks of this, her daughter in Florida sent for her, and Annie says that it was then that she truly discovered the magnitude of the disaster. She had already been warned that the airport was a mess, but again, these were just stories. It was only when she got there that it fell upon her. She said, "That's when I realized this wasn't like any hurricane before. This wasn't Hurricane Hugo. Nobody left after Hugo, but here people were, leaving in droves. The airport was full of people in wheelchairs with oxygen masks, even people hooked up to IVs. It was like a movie, and it wasn't one or two people, it was hundreds. I suddenly felt like those people who flee a war, those people who leave with nothing but what they can carry, the people who leave and maybe never return." However, Annie says that it was only when she arrived in Florida and began watching the news that the true magnitude of the event enveloped her. "I'm very positive," she said. "I always try to get rid of the negative so I can manage daily life. Because if I start crying, then I can't get organized, and you have to stay organized. If I lose it, I can't think." I asked her if she finally lost it once she got to Florida. But she said no. There she got busy once again, filling out paperwork, figuring out a new city, learning how to take the bus. I didn't want to fall into sadness, so I just saw it as an adventure. She started to sound almost manic in her energy as she narrated what she described as herself in el survival mode. But then she paused and said, "Honestly, I'm now sadder than I was in that survival mode because that mode gives you energy and excitement. But now I am back here. Now we are supposed to be back to normal, and here we are, still waiting. I'm no longer in survival mode. Now I have to absorb everything that happened." She said it precisely this way, absorber lo que ha pasado, take the hit, absorb the shock. She talked about the despair she felt when she looked around and the landscape was still in ruins. She also talked about the pain of losing her best friend. "We are not sure what happened to her. She was fine before Maria, and now she is in an assisted living facility and has lost her ability to speak." Part of what upsets Annie is that climate change itself is no longer a story, no longer something you hear about happening elsewhere. But she is worried that nobody seems to be thinking about this, that they are not rebuilding any better, turning to alternative energy sources, for example. "Nina, we have this sun beating down upon us every day," she said. "We should be using that. It should be doing something more than just giving us skin cancer." She's also extremely upset about how the recovery is unfolding, all the profiteering that is being revealed, the fact that rich parts of town have streetlights and look like nothing has happened, while her neighborhood still has no public lighting or traffic lights. None of the street lights in her neighborhood were actually knocked down by Maria, so she doesn't understand why they can't be made to work. I asked her what she thought a fair recovery would look like. If she wanted more police, and she mentioned several times she was worried about crime and mad that only the rich areas were getting police protection. But she laughed and said no, of course not, what she wanted to see people's needs attended to. She then went on to think in larger political terms, and she said, "We have to work towards something new. I know it won't be independence, because these 120 years of coloniaje americano and the ones we had before with the Spanish have made us think we can't be independent. And there are no leaders, so that alternative is not possible. In any case, she said, what we need is real sovereignty, not that soberanía de papel, where they give you sovereignty on a piece of paper, where they have some big ceremony and the US declares us independent. That is not going to solve our problems on the day-to-day. That is not what we need. What we need is real sovereignty, emotional sovereignty, mental sovereignty. This is not about the Olympics or Miss Universe or a seat at the UN. It's about feeling fully human, que nos sintamos gente. It's about feeling like a people, que nos sintamos pueblo. In other words, for Annie, real sovereignty is about addressing the dehumanization of colonialism, a matter that mere independence does not tackle. She went on to say that statehood is out of the question as well, because if this disaster has proved anything, is that the US doesn't care about us. And it's not because we're crap, it's that we just don't matter to them. I'm not even mad about it, she said. When I asked her why the US didn't care, she retorted, for whatever reason. For whatever reason. Because we are not white, because we don't have blue eyes, because we don't have oil. For whatever reason, they are not longer interested in us. They had their military bases here, they threw their bombs, they contaminated the land, and they left. They're done. It's like when a husband uses a woman and gets tired of her and leaves her. They're not interested, and there's no point in chasing after them because they are done. It's over. I should note that Annie is divorced. However, this kind of metaphor of Puerto Rico and the US as a bad romance, a jilted lover, etc., is very common. I plan to write about it somewhere. However, Annie gave it a particular spin. She went on to talk about how Puerto Rico was constantly chasing after the US as if it were a Prince Charming. But she said that the truth is that the US is not a prince. It's just a frog. They have tremendous problems, huge racial problems, terrible poverty, health problems. They basically have all the same problems we have. So if they can't resolve their problems, how are they going to resolve ours? She concluded by saying, we have to find something that works for us. We have to create something new. And I think that's where we're headed. There is a new movement that is being forged here. It still has not been born, but it's about to be born. A new future for Puerto Rico is already developing. Her words gave new meaning to the bank's eerie slogan, a new Puerto Rico lies within. There's a lot more I could say about Annie, but I know I've tried your patience, so I'm going to end with this. As I said, in this project, I want to move towards thinking about Puerto Rico's disaster as not just an unfortunate outcome, but also as a product of a post-colonial failure. This, in turn, requires asking new questions about what recovery can look like for Puerto Rico, a recovery that isn't about bringing the island back to its previous status as a site of imperial capitalism and experimentation, but about reimagining the very nature of the debts incurred and the damages caused. As Deborah Thomas argues, this is about the larger need and desire among colonized people to find new ways of being human politically in the wake of the plantation. As I've said, this is also a question of temporality and of futurity. The victims of disaster, including the disaster of colonialism, have repeatedly been left to wait for repair. As a result, it is easy to fall into pessimistic thinking about what the future might bring, particularly as accelerated processes of profiteering threaten to deepen long-standing debts and inequities. However, among Annie and many others in Puerto Rico, despite the pessimism about the future, there is still a measure of hope that this period of extended waiting, this arrested post-colonial present, is actually a period of gestation. It is worth noting that emergencia in Spanish carries a double meaning, suggesting both a state of emergency and a state of emergence. Perhaps for this reason, many in Puerto Rico remain in a hopeful wait, that what might appear to be a stalled present is actually the dawn of a new political future. Thank you.